to get started here. Thanks a lot for coming out tonight. For maybe the two people in the room who don't know me, I'm John Affleck. I run the Curley Center for Sports Journalism here at Penn State. And since 2009, we've given an award to media organizations for excellent coverage of youth sports and youth sports issues. And we've had some great winners from the New York Times and Sports Illustrated to the Boston Globe and just USA Today and a bunch of really, really talented journalists. And our guests tonight really carry on that tradition. They're from ESPN, and their story is an investigative story of tracking down a track coach who, over a period of more than 40 years, is now criminally accused of molesting more than 40 young men over the decades in various capacities. So my guests are Mark Fainaru-Wada, Greg Amante, the producer, and Mike Kessler. Mike and Mark are the reporters. They've all had really amazing careers, done things beyond this particular project, and we can get into that later if we have time. But for now, I just kind of want to focus a little bit on what they've done. If I can do this. That's the accused, Conrad Mainwaring. This is a video it's from a video that one of the accusers actually took of him that served as some helpful footage for the reporters.
Call you what you are.
So, but there's one other person in the room that I want to introduce. One of the sources on the story, one of the accusers, Robert Bender, is here tonight. He's from Pennsylvania, and I think you wanted to say something to start things off. Yeah, it's okay.
I wanted to address these gentlemen here, who I feel like they're all friends of ours. Me, my wife Christina. I'm one of the victims of Conrad Mainwaring, and well, I just have to say about some years ago, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, a friend of mine, I went to Syracuse, which is one of the stopping points on Conrad's tour, victimizing tour. A friend of mine with a hearing impairment who was in my dorm emailed me, a pretty good friend, and Robert, you know, every once in a while, I hate to tell you this, but, you know, I was in touch, I was Googling Conrad, and I came across a really disturbing website. Can you check out this link? And it was a link to one of the other victims, Tim DeSantos, who had a blog, who just was traveling in Europe, talking about his travels. And then a friend of his chimed in, hey, you know whatever happened to Conrad Mainwaring, you know, another victim. And so from there on, a bunch of people, every time they were wondering what happened, what's going on with this guy that no one ever seemed to track down. My friend left a post on the blog, and then I said something, and then more people did, and so a bunch of us sort of found each other. And Conrad's from England, and one of the main guys that was extremely active in trying to bring him to justice, an English guy named Vernon, he was just very unsuccessful for so many years of trying to, you know, he was 16, and, you know, in England, the law said it was consensual because he was a mid or older 20-year-old man was abusing a 16-year-old, so it's considered consensual. And so he was trying to help us get coalesce, and so we formed a kind of an email group where we talk and about what we could do, and it started out as like about 3 or 4 people, and then now it's like about 35 people that are on this email chain. And I think we're all in a much different mental state right now because, for one thing, you'll probably be talking about that he's in jail now, while this very slow-moving trial is proceeding in Massachusetts, where he victimized very young boys, you know, like 13 and up range. And anyway, Mike contacted me about participating in an ESPN article, and I thought, you know, like the one thing that was part of Maid Wearing Protocol was the fact that it was such a shameful thing that you went through that it would always be such a great secret. And so for most of these, like a multitude, like you said 40, he's probably victimized like in the hundreds. But it's like a great secret that it's this shameful secret. And there's one thing I have to thank you guys for is that, and it was I certainly fit into that category. It was always this secret that I guess I told my wife about, and that's about it. But now here's the opposite experience where they're like, let's talk about this. And I thought, well, this is scary as hell, but why not talk about it and maybe help somebody else that's going through the same thing? Maybe someone else victimized by the same person or other people in different situations. So I felt really good about doing it, overcoming whatever fears I had and doing that. And so then after the article, then they came back and did, participated in the video production about this whole investigative process. So I'm really grateful for participating in this because personally it's I think been healing to be able to talk about it in the name of helping other people, but also to help myself because it kind of unburdens you. It's no longer something that you have to be ashamed of because you know I didn't do anything wrong. Something was done to me, and that's what happened to a lot of other people. And also I think the ESPN, the article and the video production and their ongoing investigation and work that they've done after it was originally published, this has helped to elevate the story such that it kind of helped push along the cause that this group of people that have been trying to push forward of bringing him to justice. So I just want to thank you guys for that, and certainly if anybody has any questions, I'd be happy to answer any questions as well.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
The other, just one thing I wanted to say real briefly and generally, and then we'll get into it, is I've had experience. I was the religion editor at the Associated Press when the Catholic church abuse scandal broke, so we spent a lot of time on that. And I was in the sports department when the Sandusky scandal broke, so I covered that as well. So to me, when I first read the story and watched the video, which is quite compelling, what I wanted to say, basically with the students in mind, is this feels to me very classic serial predator kind of a situation where you might think, as an individual who maybe never experienced this, that it was like he was a coach and then on the side he did this really bad, weird thing. But it's actually kind of the reverse. He was a criminal and he used coaching as the way to perpetrate his crimes. That's a way to think about it. And so kind of with that, I was wondering, whichever of you would like to speak about it, if you can tell us the beginnings of sort of how we did it tale. Like, how did this come to your attention? You know, what did you do about it? You know, how did you get support from your editors, that sort of thing?
So it basically started with a tip. I'm a freelancer, and I was a freelancer at the time in spring of 2018 when an acquaintance of mine called me with a tip. Basically what he told me was that this friend of mine at the time was in his early to mid-50s. He explained to me that in the 1970s, when he and his older brother were kids, they they went to a sleepaway camp for boys in Massachusetts called Camp Greylock. Very heavily sports-focused camp that brought in a lot of well-known athletes and coaches to work with the kids. He said that his older brother, whose name was Victor, was sexually assaulted by this man, Conrad Mainwaring, in the late 1970s. That nobody in the family knew this until Victor was just out of high school, almost turning 18, confides in his mother that this happened to him. This would later help explain, the family thinks, his very reckless behavior, a lot of drug use, driving fast cars, just being pretty reckless and self-destructive, which had been sort of a mystery to the family as to why Victor had been acting this way. So he confides in his mother that this happened to him just before going on a camping trip in Yosemite, where he died in a freakish and tragic accident. Essentially fell off a very tall cliff. And the family always thought that he probably was acting recklessly as a, as a result of his recklessness is what led to his death, and what led to his recklessness was this abuse. I didn't know that I could really do much with it until, because it was a 40-year-old story, until Andrew explained to me that Conrad, he was certain, was still working with athletes in Los Angeles, was now in his late 60s. He and my friend Andrew was aware of this blog that Robert mentioned, this blog hosted by this other victim, Tim DeSanto. And so he had been in contact with some of those people. He'd been in contact with David O'Boyle, the guy you saw who was taking the video footage we were watching before. And so he offered to make some introductions to some of these people, and he steered me towards this blog. And from there, I was able to find the people who were using their names publicly on the blog. And I felt like if they're speaking publicly about this on the internet, they might, I'm assuming they're open to having their names out there, so I can contact some of them. I reached out to Vernon Sharples, the guy in the UK, Robert mentioned, who's the earliest victim that we know about. And did a bunch of preliminary reporting, got about 5 or 7 people to talk to me at length. Most of them had agreed to talk on the record, but not all of them. And I did what I could to find out more about Conrad just through internet research, but quickly learned that he was a ghost, which in some ways made the story more interesting. What we did know is that he had coached a very well-known athlete, Olympic athlete, 2-time Olympic hurdling gold medalist in the early 2000s. And so that made it, to me, like a very current story. It took it from the late 1970s and 1980 to more into the present, especially that he's working around the UCLA campus, or he had been, and at other facilities in the Los Angeles area. So once I had established all of those things, I put together a story proposal, which is something that you have to do as a freelance journalist, and usually when you're on staff, to a certain extent, you have to write proposals. As a freelancer, you really have to go the extra mile, because you have to really sell yourself, and you're convincing somebody to invest a lot of time and money into you. That's where Greg came in. Greg and I, in 2016 and 2017, separately, we both did the same journalism fellowship at the University of Michigan. He was in the class ahead of me, but I had met him during the interview process, and he was living in Ann Arbor still when I showed up for my fellowship, and we became friends, and we talked about how cool it would be to collaborate on something. I've dabbled in television, but not really anything serious. And so we had just sort of said, let's keep the door open to that. And that's the point at which I wrote the pitch, and I thought, like, how can I get this story told as widely as I think it needs to be told? And I sent it to Greg, and I guess I could probably hand it off to you, and you can say what you thought. You know?
Hey, good evening. Thanks for having us. So I think at that time, at ESPN, we didn't really work with freelancers too much, because we have a staff. We have a staff of great reporters. We have a staff of great producers, and we just don't really go outside that much. But this idea about a year before started kind of germinating in my head, and that is a collaborative journalism. Hey, if you got a story, I work for a network that has resources, and we're able to do stories like this. We were on the road, and we took multiple trips. This was not an inexpensive story, and it took the resources of ESPN, I think, to do the story. So about a year before, I started thinking about working with people outside of ESPN, bring a story, we'll use our resources, we'll put this together. And so when Mike called, I felt this is a perfect story for it, to pitch to my bosses that, hey, we got somebody from the outside, I think, bring them in, let's try to do this story. I think it's a good story to do. We could add staff to it, and they went for it. And I believe, I think you see more of this now, right? You'll see more collaborations between outlets, and I think as you get out there too, it's something to think about yourselves, like, find a place that has the resources, pitch them those stories, and, or if you work in different places, see how you can work together. You'll see more of this, and you're seeing more of it now. Bosses said yes to it. They added Mark to it. And then the three of us went about doing the story.
How did you, and Robert, if you want to chime in here, I think an issue when you're a younger journalist in particular is, how do I do the tough interview? How do I gain people's trust to talk to me about sensitive issues that are important? How did that work here? How did that process go? What did you say to people?
I mean, I think, we talked about this, Mike and I talked to a couple of classes today, and I think this issue of trust it's so critical to all reporting, not just the difficult reporting like this, but I think it's really, you're trying to convince people to talk to you at the core of what you do, and that takes something. That's not, people don't just like randomly decide they're just going to spit out what they want to talk about. So in this case, I think one of the benefits we had and is that working at ESPN, as Greg said, the resources are absurd at our place. I feel how, we're really lucky. We had the ability to say to our bosses, look, to do a story like this right, Mike had established relationships with a number of the victims and had talked to those men, but we all agreed that if we were going to do the story right, we needed to go meet them and see them in person for a number of reasons. But the biggest one was to establish this level of trust and to convince people if we were going to tell the story both in a written form but also in a TV form, we were going to have to look them in the eye, explain who we were, give them a sense of what the process would be, talk through the fears that they had, be empathetic to those fears, and be willing to walk through any and all of those concerns. I think the other reason that it was important to do this was you want to really be transparent and open with people on a story like this. And so I think we had these hard conversations with Robert and virtually every victim, which was, look, this is, in many cases, we're talking about issues that happened 40 years ago or 30 years ago. And there's a real challenge to corroborating those kinds of stories, right? And so there was a real need to be able to press the guys on what their memories were, on how they could prove what they had experienced without having to have them go through and be re-victimized. And I think the only way to do that was to establish sort of an in-person relationship and to be really open and honest about what we were trying to accomplish to establish that level of trust. And I just think that's critical.
I want to add to that, and that is like, I totally agree, transparent, meet them, but also for some of you that are going to get into television journalism, I get this question a lot. It's just not normal bringing cameras into a normal family's house. So if it's a sensitive topic, take the extra step, meet them without cameras, without lights, without camera people, so they get to know you in their own setting and they're able to feel more comfortable.
Yeah.
And we did that in virtually every case. I think we met every guy before we pulled a camera out or brought a camera to them. Even when we went to England to talk to Vernon, and we spent a bunch of time with Vernon before we pulled out the cameras.
Yeah.
And I think Greg's right, because I think you're asking people to do something that's incredibly unnatural.
I want to say something. I can speak to that directly because when this whole idea of this article came up, there was a lot of talk amongst the group about being exploited. ESPN just wants to make, this is just like a sensational thing. They don't care about us. They want to make some money. They want to like raise their profile. And that's the opposite of what it was. But we had, you know, I never thought that or felt that, certainly not after talking to Mike and Mark. So yeah, so that was a hurdle that on our side we had to get over. But from my point of view, in talking to these guys, I know, you all know when you talk to someone, you can read what their attitude is, and I felt that their heart was in it, that they were in it for the right reason, and it wasn't to make a quick buck. Actually, we talked about this, and I don't remember which one of you guys I was talking to about it, but I think you're saying, on the contrary, this is not to make money. We're spending money on it. This is something that we're. This is like
There's no quick buck in
yeah, no,
investigative
exactly.
journalism. There's not even a slow buck.
So it's just like, I think what they're saying and what I would say is, if you know that your heart is in it and you're doing it for the right reason, the person that you're talking to will feel that, and they'll get that. So you check where you are, and then they'll read that.
I do think, and again, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but I think it's really important to reiterate that good journalism, especially good journalism that takes time, or good journalism about sensitive topics, just requires so much patience and so much more time than anybody realizes. And a lot of you are probably working on a pretty tight deadline, quick turnaround stories for newspaper, whatever it is that you're working on, but where you do have to kind of swoop in and get what you need and then get out of there so you can file a story. And this is a very different animal, and I mean it's why I got into it, but I can't stress enough how important it is just to like hit the brakes and put yourself in the position of the people you're talking to, who, like Greg said, are not used to having cameras in their faces, let alone in their living rooms, let alone talking about very high stakes, very sensitive, very personal stuff.
So Mainwaring is English, but he was born in Antigua. For a long time he was English anyway. I don't know what his citizenship is right now. But and so I'm interested in a couple of things, and maybe you can speak to it. But sort of figuring out the TikTok of it from your end, the sort of how did you? It must have seemed very confusing at first with a lot of different pieces from different times. I'm curious about putting together the timeline. So that's one thing. And then I also, a thing that stood out to me was, so Mainwaring, the reason I know he's from Antigua is because in the piece that he goes and he is an Olympian for Antigua, which I'm assuming that he was not good enough to represent Britain.
Yeah, it's part of the Commonwealth, so
Yeah.
he
Right.
was able to.
Yeah.
To get in. And so and how he traded on that to attract attention to himself as an attractive, charismatic figure. So if you want to address some of that.
I think in terms of the TikTok, I'll let Mark, it was confusing. Remember, I think there was a day where he said, can you put together?
Yeah, we made a timeline because it became really, that issue became real. And it's interesting because that's become really instructive for me, is I've been making timelines on stories ever since, actually, that I had not typically been doing. And I think it's a really useful exercise when you have a complicated story to go through that. And I think for us, it was a grounding. There was a grounding element of that to the reporting, because you could then look at a document, because you're always like in your head, you have all these things that you're trying to process. But I think by putting it down someplace and being able to refer to that repeatedly, not only could you then go, okay, this is where he was this year, but you saw a context to what was happening in ways that you couldn't if you didn't have it down in writing. So in Antigua, I mean, there were a lot of challenges around nailing down this question of where was Conrad when, and what was he doing, even where was he born. We spent money, we thought for a period we were going to go to Antigua, and then we didn't. I don't remember why. I think it was we really wanted to do a trip to Antigua and get the company to pay for it, which they would have done actually, I think. But it was hard to really nail down what we were going to find out there.
And we didn't know if he had family there.
Yeah. So we ultimately did hire somebody on the ground who found his birth certificate for us. And, but as Mike said at the onset, one of the weirdest things about Conrad from the very beginning was, which is unbelievable in this day and age, he was a ghost on the internet. There's virtually no record of Conrad's existence on the web. The blog post changed that, and other little pieces here and there. But that's what really made the reporting challenging in a lot of ways. I forget what your other question was.
It was just the idea of one thing that I felt like just was particularly insidious. I don't know why it stuck in my head as I read and watched it, was him trading on his Olympic fame,
that was his calling card.
Which was almost a con. He actually did represent a nation in the Olympics, but he was essentially Eddie the Eagle.
But he's not the first that has done that.
He was.
I mean, all industries, you'll see people cashing in on their fame.
Yeah, there's an amazing photo. I think it's in the present. It's probably in the TV piece too.
It is.
There's an amazing photo of him at the camp in Massachusetts, Camp Greylock, where he's got like his participation medal out from the Olympics, and he's just surrounded by kids, and they're just in awe of the moment. I mean, they're just blown away by this idea. And Robert will tell you, I remember you telling us when he arrived at Syracuse to begin his first day, Conrad met him that day and was helping him move into his place. And one of the first things Conrad talked about, if I remember correctly, is...
I knew he was an Olympian within about the first 5 minutes of meeting him.
Yeah. I mean, there's no doubt that was part of the con.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But it was real, right? So.
Yeah.
We've been going about half an hour, and we have smart people in the room, and so I'm guessing somebody's got a question.
You mentioned it, how a story like this is a totally different animal to working on a deadline for a beat or something. Can you just kind of detail, for the story and just in general, how your preparation and note-taking and just the process as a whole is different, your mentality?
Yeah, I mean, so I don't have a deep background with newsroom. My newsroom experience is more recent. The last couple of years, I came into journalism through the magazine world, which works at a slower pace. But what I can tell you is that coming from the magazine world, what the sort of general philosophy was, like, everyone else is doing it fast, and they may be doing it piece by piece and day after day on a tight deadline. Our job is to do it really comprehensively and hopefully write the article of record, so that if there's one piece that you can go find, it's this story. And so that's sort of like that's what I have in the back of my head whenever I start on a long story. I'm sure with both of these guys, of course, as well, because they work on long form stuff. Process, I think one really important thing we've talked about, I think is a good piece of takeaway for you guys, is a pitch, a proposal, even if you're on staff somewhere, especially if you're just getting started and you need to convince an editor to really invest time and resources into your project, is you really have to do some preliminary reporting. If you're at a day job, you have to find the time to do it or do it off hours. If you're a freelancer, you have to do it for free. I worked on this story probably 6 or 8 weeks, fairly straight, for no money, not knowing I was gonna, I did have a pretty good sense that I was gonna be able to sell this story because it was so obviously in need of telling. But that's not always the case. But I doubled down and made sure that I wrote a proposal that nobody could say no to. Least of all him, because he's gonna vouch for me. So you really have to go the extra mile. It's like the job application where you just have to figure out some way to to stand out. So that's a big part of the process for these kinds of stories. Note-taking versus recording, I feel like all that stuff is sort of like getting in the weeds about the actual sort of going about the reporting, I think becomes really personal. Different people have different comfort zones with, like, some people can take really great shorthand and not need a recorder. Some people can't take notes at all. Some people can't read their handwriting. That would be me. I use like multiple tape recorders when I can. Sometimes you can't. Sometimes you're driving and somebody calls and you have to like pull over and write down what they told you. So it's hard. I think the key is just try everything. See what works, see what doesn't. Ask other people what works. Try different. Just try it all. There's no right or wrong way to do it as long as you get it right in the end. The timeline is, though, I will say, Mark said he's new to the timeline. I can't do a big, complicated story without one. There's just too many moving parts, and I'm a pretty organized person, and I get overwhelmed with clutter. So for me, I have to have that because I'm uncomfortable if it's not organized. So.
Let me just hit you a little bit again on the pitch. What's a great pitch gotta have?
In my opinion, a great pitch needs a strong headline. It doesn't have to be like the catchiest or most clever thing, especially in this day and age when web headlines especially are so on the nose at this point. Like magazine headlines used to be very clever, like you wouldn't quite know what it means until you read the subhead or what we call the deck in print journalism. I don't know what lingo you guys use at this point, but you need a strong headline and a really strong deck or subhead that essentially gives you the top line information, just like you'd see in a newspaper. New York Times is a great example. They'll have a headline and then they'll have like 3 little bullet pointed subheads now, online anyway. You need to demonstrate that you've done some homework, that you can deliver a worst case scenario story that's still worth doing, and a best case scenario that has to be done. I think you need to show what sources you have, who's willing to talk to you, what sources you hope to get, what's realistic. You don't want to oversell and then find yourself like not delivering. And also you need to show that there's a lot you don't know, and you need to kind of admit that up front and say, these are the things I don't know, and this is what I see. If I can figure these things out, it's going to make this a more well-rounded story, and it's going to matter for X, Y, and Z reason. And so, and I'm being humble in admitting it because you can't know everything until you start. But here's where I think it's going to go.
I would just add one thing: clarity. Like,
Yeah.
make sure that when you explain it, you don't have to explain it a second time or a third time.
Yeah.
Clarity is really, I think, a big key as well.
Clear before clever is the.
And I just think this is lost, I think this is true for a lot of professional journalists too. I've had this discussion with my boss about our own unit, because I went to journalism school and nobody ever taught me how to write a pitch. And I don't suspect you guys are actually, and I don't say that critically, but it's not a common thing that's taught actually. And I think people think a pitch is like, oh, I'm going to do a story on Title IX. That's not an idea. That's a broad concept. But people think they can say to their boss, like, let's do this story. It's the 50th anniversary of Title IX, so let's do that. But I think underscoring what Mike was saying is you have to do some reporting. Like a pitch is not a pitch without having done any reporting. So that's actually part of the process. You don't want to pitch anything unless you've actually done enough to really understand that there's a story there to be had and that you can shape and figure out what it's going to possibly be. And I think too many people sort of fail with that, and they don't recognize and because they just think, oh, I'm going to have a story idea, and here it is.
Yeah, and just again to underscore this whole idea, I worked at an NPR affiliate for a couple of years as an investigative editor, and I I wound up working on a lot of stories that had been assigned kind of hastily before I had gotten there, or while I was there sometimes by other editors who were great at doing certain things, but they would assign stories that were really big and ambitious, and the stories would come in and they would be just sort of aimless and just, I could tell, they'd say, hey, can you take a look at this, like, we're stuck, and it's like, well, we need to like rewind back to the part where the writer pitched you and talk about like, what is this story to begin with and what are we trying to accomplish? Because it's a drag when you're, many months into a story and then you realize like, I don't even know why we're doing this or what this is. And then you've got a draft that is really not serviceable and you either have to kill it as an editor, you have to kill it, which is the worst feeling in the world. Or you have to go back and rethink it, and sometimes it can be really a lot harder to take something that's already not in great shape and figure out how to start over with the existing material, pull the thread out of it, figure out how to restitch it. And so the more you do on the front end, the better. Just like always do that front end reporting. And if it sounds like a pain, that's because it kind of is, but it also does bring clarity to what it is that you're trying to do and will help you convince yourself that, yes, this needs to be done, or like maybe there's not something here after all.
Save you a lot of hassle down the road.
Yeah.
The one thing that I'll say with an eye toward the fact that I went to like an end of year, the first end of year ceremony today is for everybody who's sending out resumes right now. Clarity is great. This is who I am, and this is what I can do for you. It's not about convincing yourself you can do it. It's about convincing the other folks that you can do it. Other questions? Yeah.
How long does a story like this take, excuse me, from like, your first tip and like starting to gather information all the way to publication?
Well, this was,
Too long.
yeah, too long. This was probably, we think 14 months from the time that we started working on it as a team. Is that right? No, from the time that I pitched it, more or less.
Yeah.
And then after that.
Yeah, this is important. The after bit's important.
Yeah.
Because you guys didn't just like, okay, here it is and that's the end.
Yeah, there were all these follow-up stories. There was a lot of blowback after the story. There were some lawsuits were filed.
Not against us.
Not against us. The detective in Massachusetts that saw our work because he was in this. He heard about this camp, this summer camp that was where some of this stuff took place, which is in his jurisdiction, and he began working towards bringing charges against Mainwaring dating back to however long ago, and so there's all these follow-up stories to do that really. Mark was more the lead on at that point because I was busy with a full-time day job. But so all told, I mean, we've been following this for going on 4 years.
Yeah, I guess that's
Yeah.
right. But I mean, the total on the package is probably about, 14, 15 months. And part of the reason this took, I mean, I think there's a number of reasons, but you have to remember we were trying to put together, we wrote a 10,000 word written piece, and we also did a 25-minute TV piece, and then later did a 4-hour podcast. So you're juggling a bunch of different types of mediums and trying to sort of line all that up and get the timing right and being able to do it all, it takes a lot of time. So, I mean, but I also think the reporting was really hard and a slog, and and you had to be patient, as Mike said, to be able to, talk to as many guys as you could. At some point, we did have to say, like, we're done, and I think that was a little difficult in some ways because we knew there were so many more victims, and we kept hearing about new people. But I think that's why that's one of the reasons it took as long as it did, is because we're trying to tell the story in a lot of different ways.
From a video standpoint too, it's just not an easy piece to do. It's not a piece about a guy that's really well known that there's tons of video about, and also you have to gather photos and all sorts of stuff. So it's time consuming.
Yeah, and this came up earlier when you weren't here, but, you know, Conrad being the ghost that he is and was, you know, there's nothing, almost nothing on the internet, you know, like, getting the visual assets, aside from getting people on camera, but for, you know, for Greg to get visual assets necessary to like really bolster the story was really time consuming.
I think we spent an entire day in a library in England looking for old
We did.
newspaper articles to try to like get some photos from there.
And old phone books trying to find his address.
Yeah,
So looking for places he lived.
Yeah.
yeah, went to his house he grew up in. Yeah, it was a lot of work.
That sort of leads to the, like, what's the gratifying part for you? Like, what moment is the gratifying part? Seeing it published, when he's accused, when you're confronting him in Southern California? What's, like, what's the part of it that's sort of the payoff for you?
I think there's a lot, I mean, honestly, one of the most gratifying parts happened tonight when Robert contacted Mark and asked if he could come and say something on our behalf. Like, that's about as good as it gets. Knowing that there are more people like him who feel like we did some good makes it all the better. So for me, that's it. To me, the fact that he might wind up spending the rest of his life in jail or might not see the light of day before his life is over, like, I think the world is a better place with him not in society. I don't know that like our penal system is the best place for anybody who has done what he has done, or for anybody who's committed any crime for that matter. But at the same time, so I'm a little conflicted. I'm like, he should be locked away, but I don't want to sound too punitive about it, because he's obviously like a deeply troubled person. Then again, he victimized a lot of people, and he needs to be kept at a safe distance. But I don't know, just knowing that we did some good feels pretty good.
Yeah, it's absolutely. I mean, there was so many gratifying things, but I mean, really none of them will trump the fact that, you know, as I've heard many times, it's helped some men like find closure or be able to move on from this. And you really don't get a chance often to do stories that are really going to have like a positive impact on just people's lives. And when you do, nothing will trump that. That's the most gratifying.
Mark, can you tell us about confronting him? Like, how that came about and how you...
Was that gratifying?
That was not gratifying. So there's a moment in the TV piece where we do a confrontation interview with Conrad, and he was in LA at the time, and so we decided to do it on camera because we thought we had one shot at him. And I've never actually done one of these where you confront somebody and walk up to them with a camera and say, here's who I am and this is what I want to do. And so I was sort of terrified going into it. It was unfortunate too because Greg was not able to be there, and I've worked with Greg for a long time now, and he's actually the first producer I worked with on a story. I came from newspapers, so I don't know shit about television. I mean, I really didn't. And Greg taught me a lot about it. So not having him there was a drag for us, and hurt the situation in some ways. But anyway, we set it up so that I had a cameraman right behind me. I was wearing a mic, and we were going to walk up to him at this track, and I was going to introduce myself and say, this is who I am, and we really want to talk to you. And we think he knew by then that we've been working on the story because there were certain not victims, but there were certain people who were in touch with him who we think we were in touch with, who might have told him. So
he jumps when he hears...
Well, I walk up to him, and we tried to plan for everything. And what we didn't, and he's like 60 at this point, or in his 60s, and he's got a walker because he's had hip surgery. So we tried to plan for every sort of possible reaction from him. What we did not plan for was him to stand up and bolt. And nor that at the age of 60 whatever with hip surgery, 67, he could bolt really fast. So
On his
like,
walker.
with his walker, so suddenly I'm reaching my hand out and saying, hi, Mr. Manwaring, I'm Mark Fainer-Iwata from ESPN. And I don't even think I've gotten ESPN out.
No,
And he's just like up,
Yeah.
and he's got his walker, and
an
he's
Olympic
turned,
athlete.
and he's like an Olympic athlete again, it's true. Like, and so it's a preposterous scene of me chasing him through a parking lot. And, you know, it's horrifying, right? Here's a, you know, I'm 50s now, I'm 57 or whatever, it's a 55 or whatever, and I'm chasing this, you know, supposedly hobbling man on his walker, and I'm thinking, this is horrible. This is gonna look so bad, and this is awful, and it's embarrassing, but I'm trying to keep my composure and throwing questions at him, and,
There's 5 or 6 other people.
yeah, so now the rest of the crew is out. There's a sound guy with a boom. There's other camera guys. And we're all, I mean, this is an absurd scene. We're all chasing him across a parking lot. And we finish, probably takes about 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm, you know, my brother who I work with gives me a bunch of grief because he watched the video of it. And I'm like gasping for breath trying to chase this old man. And we finish, and Mike and I are looking at each other like horrified. And the crew is celebrating. The crew's like, that was amazing. It was so good. It's great television. It's really good. And I'm really embarrassed and thinking this is a really horrible thing. And I remember Mike and I went to breakfast afterwards. We left the crew and we had some other work to do, and the crew went off, and we went to breakfast and we rehashed this whole thing. And it was, we did not have that reaction. Our reaction was much more like, is this really going to be bad? What's this going to look like? And I'm really worried about actually how that would present on television.
And it felt bad.
And it just felt
Yeah.
sick, you know?
Even though we had every reason to believe that all of these allegations were true, it just
Right.
felt gross.
But I think the reason it, like, in the end, the reason it worked and was not this sort of shameful look on television is because it's hard to have empathy for him, right? Like, he's not an empathetic figure in any way. And so,
By the time you get there.
you know, but yeah, you're like, this is the deal, and so we're gonna try and talk to him. But that was the least gratifying
Yeah, and I think
part of the experience.
I think in terms of, I think what the young guy up there had asked about, you know, time put in. I mean, you know, I've done a bunch of these in my career. None of them are, and I actually think you do really well, even if you're chasing old men. But I mean, it takes time, and if you may do something like this, I broke my wrist like just the days before, so I couldn't fly out there. But I remember I was out there for 4 days,
Yeah.
staking this guy out, finding out his movements. That was a park that we had no idea that he was going to. So I guess my advice to you is if you're gonna do something like this, just spend some time beforehand trying to find the person's movements, where they're gonna be. You don't want to be chasing a person around like in a car and trying to figure out where they're going. At that point, you're in trouble, so.
Yeah, it requires, you have to be very deliberate because, you know, you invest all this time and you don't want to blow it by being careless or being hurried just one day because, you know, you're really hungry or something.
You might have one chance, that's it.
Yeah, and well, and that, just to explain why we confronted him the way we did, we thought we had one shot at him, as Mark said. There was some concern that he was a flight risk because he has managed to stay a step ahead of his accusers and a step ahead of the law for so long, and he had been from university to university and often left under mysterious circumstances, usually in a lot of cases we learned because of accusations. And so, you know, we had been warned, like, hey, if he finds out, he might skip town on you guys. So we felt like, I mean, ideally we would have just knocked on his door and tried, but we felt like we didn't have that luxury. So it was just like, well, we're just gonna have to do it the way they do it in the movies. And I would like to avoid ever having to do that again, really. It was a pretty unpleasant feeling.
I think it's probably was my fault because every day that I was out there, like it would take him from that door to here would take him maybe 10 minutes to walk. For someone, I was like, hey, don't worry, you know, you can't move very fast. And then I hear how fast he was. I thought, wow, what are we talking about?
The same,
What are we talking
same
about?
guy. I do want to say one thing before we finish, because I know you're gonna like,
No, I got a couple more.
okay, so just on the gratifying piece, these guys sort of expressed it, so I don't want to like belabor this point, but, you know, Robert came to sort of say something nice to us, which is wonderful and incredibly gratifying. And it is, you know, it makes me really proud. And as Greg says, like, there's nothing better than doing work that actually has impact, and that's the beauty of the unit we're on. But we've all said this at various points when we've been asked about this, like, there is no story without Robert or any of the victims. Like, all these guys had ridiculous courage to be willing to talk to us, and in really difficult circumstances, and to trust us to tell their stories. And that is not an easy thing to do. And so I just want to say, like, I think we're really grateful that you trusted us, and not just that you're here, but that you had the trust of us. And this is so true for all these other guys. I mean, we've probably talked to 40 or 50 victims at this point. And
Well, you just have to be patient. You have to wait about 40 years until some of these people are ready to talk about it.
Exactly.
You kind of caught us at the right time. A lot of people just really wanted to unburden themselves, and
Exactly.
it was the right time for.
Yeah, well, no matter how many years had passed, it still took a lot of courage to do it, so.
Does anybody have a question that they're done to ask? Mark, can't have you in the room in front of students without asking, in retrospect, like, as you think back on a couple of other the things that you've done, Game of Shadows and League of Denial. For anybody who doesn't know what I'm talking about, Mark co-wrote big pieces that really broke the steroid scandal in baseball in the early part of the century, and also a really very tough, hard-hitting book about concussions in the NFL and the league's denial of concussions, hence the title. And where do you think we are now on those issues, as far as steroids in baseball and player safety in football? And if you have any thoughts that come to mind when you think about those stories.
So on steroids in baseball, I mean, the commissioner, who at the time was Bud Selig, and he always used to, like, after these scandals came out, he would talk about a period of time, an era, like, we had a steroid era and we got through the steroid era. And I always thought that was really good PR and a real spin. The reality is, like, one thing I learned from doing those stories is that there are a lot of different drugs that can be used. It's really easy to get them, and it's really easy to beat the system. So I'm really cynical when it comes to this issue. Like, the idea that baseball now is clean or other sports are clean, to me, is a false concept. Like, baseball didn't have an era that's over now. You know, there is better testing, but there's better drugs too. And so I'm not, you know, like, if there was another Balka that happened tomorrow,
It wouldn't surprise me.
well, no, it wouldn't surprise me in the least. Like, I just got, you know, I just think that, you know, for the players, and I don't blame the players for making the choices that they did. I think, you know, the drugs work, they're really effective, and the players benefit from that. And in many cases, we did a story, one of the first stories I did at ESPN was a story on a guy who'd been named and identified for using these drugs. And he was one of the very few people to actually talk openly about his use. Everybody else lied about it and said they hadn't done it, basically, or sort of dissembled in some way. And this guy admitted it, and one of the things he said that was most powerful to me was he felt really guilty. He was a fringe pitcher, and he felt really guilty because he recognized that the use of the drugs had kept him on a roster that kept somebody else off the roster who was probably clean. And I think that you know, that's the least talked about part of the steroid issue, I think. And so I don't, you know, I'm not somebody who buys the idea that this has been solved. I think the football issue is a different one. You know, for football, this is an existential issue, right? Baseball players could make the choice to use drugs or not, but on the concussion issue, it's just a part of the game. And it's not really concussions, it's repetitive trauma. And that's just part of the sport. There's no way to get rid of it. And so I think the question will be, you know, if we find out 20 years from now that 50% of players are going to end up, NFL players are going to end up getting CTE, are we going to have some sort of moral change in the way we view the sport? But I say all that, and I mean, I watch the NFL every Sunday. You know, I still do. I watch it differently, I think, than I used to. But it's an amazing sport. The athletes are incredible, and
Boxing has
you
been
know,
one of the most popular sports in this country since the 1730s.
it was, yeah, not so much anymore, but
still,
yeah.
combat sports.
I mean, the violence of the sport is really compelling, and I don't think there's any, you know, I just think we have to be honest about that. That's what it is. It's a really violent sport, and watching it, especially in person, is a real awakening. I think one of the things that football benefits from, sorry, I'm prattling about this, but I think one of the things that football benefits from is that as good as HD TV has gotten and TV has gotten to see things, until you actually see a game in person and are on the sidelines, you have no idea how fast and violent the sport is. You know, it's like watching war on television. Like, it's not, the sport, my brother makes the analogy that it's the difference between flying over a freeway and cars going by 60 and 70 miles an hour, and that feeling, versus standing on the median and the cars going by you 60 and 70. It's that loud, it's that fast, and it's that violent, and it's just different.
Well, we've hit 8 o'clock, so the traditional question to successful guests in the Curley Center is, do you have any advice for the students who are out here? So we'll go through the panel. Do you have anything you want to tell them about doing investigative reporting or career in journalism in general?
I think with the investigative reporting, and there's so much advice, but I think a big part of it for me that I've learned over and over the years is, like, try to be as empathetic as you can, even when you're writing about people who are so-called bad guys, especially when you're interviewing and reporting stories on people who are not used to talking to reporters. We've said this before tonight and to other classes. We're in the business of trying to make people transparent and hold people to account for their actions. We have to model that behavior ourselves, I think. Obviously, you can't tell every source exactly what you're up to as a reporter. You can't always show your hand, but you do owe it to people, I think, to let them know what it is you're doing and what your motivations are, what it's going to be like for them if they talk to you. It's not a business, much to, I think, a lot of people's surprise, it's not a business about tricking people into talking to you or about being sneaky. I think the more sort of transparent and honest you can be, the more empathetic you can be, the better your work will be, the more people will trust you, the more you will sleep better at night as well, and I think you'll find it more gratifying. Career-wise, I think it's just, if you know what you want to do, go after it. Be resourceful. Be persistent. There's a lot of rejection, especially if you're freelancing and trying to sell stories. But there's just a lot of rejection. Period. So be persistent. If you want to do it, do it. If you don't know exactly what kind of journalism you want to do, but you want to be in this field, just try different stuff out and eliminate what doesn't work. You know, give things a fair shot. Nothing's wasted time. There's value in every job that I've done, big and small. You know, whether it's about something that's seemingly kind of petty or really, really important. So I think you know, just see what works and sort of find your way through it. But it's really fun. It's satisfying. It can be frustrating. Doesn't always pay great, but it's a really fun line of work. And you get to do things and meet people that you would ordinarily never get to do or get to meet, and learn about things you would ordinarily never get to learn about, and that is like an amazing privilege, I think. So that's my way of saying go for it.
Greg?
Well, great would say, you know, these stories are hard and the business is hard to get into. And so don't make it harder on yourself. Like, believe in yourself, be persistent, and just don't tie yourself down. Just if you think you can do it, then do it, and go for it, as Mike says. But the one thing I would say is, don't take a shortcut. Like, there's so many shortcuts too, and so maybe you'll get a shortcut thrown your way because you know somebody that's in the business. Get good. Like, really put the work in and get good. I'm 59 years old. You want to be 59 years old and work in this industry? Be good, because you'll be discovered really fast if you're not, and you'll be out in about 2 or 3 years. So really learn your craft. It's not a career, it's a calling, and really embrace that.
It's intimidating to follow you too. I mean, I would just say 2 things that are, you know, when I graduated from college, I knew I wanted to be in newspapers. I knew I wanted to be a journalist. And the idea of just simply moving into print was an easy sort of thing to do, actually, at that time. But I think you guys are in a dramatically different place in time, obviously. And I think one thing I've learned is how critical it is to have a bunch of different tools at your disposal. And so I would encourage everybody to be not just learning how to write a print story or a magazine story, but learning how to do video, learning how to do podcast work. I think the more mix of talents you bring to the table, the more opportunities you're going to have. I mean, it seems obvious on its face for sure, but I think the idea of specializing is to your detriment at this point. Like, I'm not saying you can't ultimately find a newspaper job and do it and be happy in it and successful in it, or a TV job, but I think there's so much blending of those things now. I mean, I never thought I would be doing television in a million years. You know, I spent almost, you know, much of my career not, and I was like, had no interest in it. I never thought I'd do a podcast. And so learning how to do all those things was really critical. So I think that's one thing. And the second thing is an extension of what Greg was saying about being good. I would particularly say be good at being a reporter. And I think, you know, there's a distinction between being a reporter and being a writer, or being on camera and being able to present yourself in that way. And I say this all the time when I talk to students, like, I'll take a great reporter or a good reporter, I'll take a good reporter over a great writer any day of the week. Because the stories are going to ultimately, if you're able to do the job and do the reporting, the granular detail that you're going to get from learning how to do that reporting is going to serve those stories, and they're going to make them better. So even if you're not the greatest writer in the world, those stories are going to be dramatically more powerful by virtue of being able to do the actual reporting piece. And I think if you're going to focus on getting great at something, initially that's what I would focus on.
Great.
That's great advice.
I just want to say it was hard for me to watch the video and to read the article, but I think they're really great pieces of journalism, and I just wanted to, I don't know if you've made are there still links available? Because I think after this, if you haven't, it'd be really inspiring to see, you know, in that sense, it was, you know, inspiring to see how something was just crafted together to tell the story in a cathartic and constructive way. So.
That's great. Let's give them a hand.